My topic is the Optometric practice, our platform to share Jesus. There's two key points that I would like to make at the outset of this conversation with you and I today, and it has to do with a text that I cherish and recite to myself often in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 21. And it reads this way, and you will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way you should walk, whether you turn to the right or to the left." It's in my opinion that the first challenge for most of us is to recognize the voice of opportunity in the physical world or in the spiritual. And the second challenge, at least for me, and apparently I'm not the only one because Dr. Chen gave me some warm thoughts last night, is that I get real cerebral and I start arguing with God about how this doesn't make sense and I don't want to do it. But if I can get through those two hurdles, then God is finally ready to use me. So let's have a little conversation this afternoon, if I can figure out how to run this thing. There we go. So I had a little help with my objectives today. The first one is to illustrate the importance of a whole person care and how we have been able to share Jesus in our optometric practice, to discuss the importance of interpersonal relationships in the workplace, and to share stories connected with colleagues through sharing the love of God's presence with them. Thirdly, to illustrate practical principles of the whole person care through community outreach and how sharing Jesus with the community can have positive impact. And lastly, to inspire participants to implement these principles by sharing personal stories of lives transformed. Apple Eye Care has been around for about almost 30 years. And our motto and mission is, "Where you are the apple of our eye." It describes the value we place on each patient, priceless. The value we place on each patient by delivering services in a kind and friendly manner. The value we place on each patient's input as we seek solutions to vision problems. The value we place on vision-enhancing products when fit to each patient. And the value we place on our community as we educate for clear vision and eye health. The value we place on vision, priceless. Part of our mission in staff education includes the following statements that I'd like to make. Patients come into the office with more than just two eyes. We can recognize and acknowledge the whole person. Warm greeting. We show we care by giving the extra mile to greet and to let them know that the patient is a real person. Personal attention. Each member listens to the patient at each step to give the service and education needed to make a difference. We value each patient by delivering services in a kind and friendly manner. We value each patient's input as we seek solutions for vision problems. We have a huddle every morning, and it's our practice to offer a short word of prayer. Make sure we center on what it is that's most important. If there's some opportunities to focus on our schedule, we try to do that. But we also talk about serving each other during the day. Part of our mission in staff education includes this statement: we understand the value of each patient both in dollars and eternity. And we have to do both. We value their time and the services and the products of value, and we offer budget-sensitive items. We do that because we live in a poor county. The median income in our county is $28,000. So it's not exactly a rich area. We coordinate care with Free Community Clinic and the Lions Club. We recognize grief, loss, anger, and frustration as an opportunity to pray for them in the exam or in dispensary floor as needed. We give illustrations in real life by simply stopping to have prayer with the patient, regardless of where it is. It could be in the optical, it could be in the waiting area, it can be in the exam room. It doesn't really matter. When the need occurs, everyone in the office understands that they have permission to meet that need at that moment. And the best way to teach that is to model it. We seek to hold the patient's hand when appropriate to show compassion with a difficult diagnosis. How do we open the conversation for a whole person in the God-centered solutions? I think this is really important, and I'm just going to share with you my particular perspective, but I think there's many in this room could add to this list and demonstrate it rather easily. The first thing I think is really important is you make eye contact with the patient. You have to look at them and realize that they have to feel that you see them. Shake their hand while making eye contact if you're comfortable with it. Some of our staff are comfortable with it, and some of our staff are not. Address them by name. Ask them about their day and pause. And in our county, many times they will fill your ears for a number of minutes, telling you about their day. I always thank the patient for their trust at the end of the exam. So after I have summarized the recommendations that we have for them, which are many times multiple, then I thank them while I shake their hand and say, thank you for trusting me with your eyes. Sometimes I end the conversation, and notice I use the word sometimes, I don't every. In the conversation with this question, is there anything else I can do for you? Very open-ended question. Less than 2 months ago, my patient Sue came into the practice. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, retired, a warm, round-faced individual with a very inclusive attitude about the world. And when I said, is there anything else I could do for you? She tipped her head down like this and then looked back up. She says, well, if you have a couple more minutes, doctor. I says, sure, Sue. She says, well, I have to tell you a story. And it's very hard for me to tell you this story. She says, a number of years ago, I discovered that there were some people that were related to us that nobody knew we were related. It was a relationship that was unearthed. And in the process, I discovered I had some cousins and their families. And at a family reunion, we fell in love with these people that we did not know existed. She says, about 6 months ago, an email showed up and stated that part of this one person in this group had passed, and they had left a large sum of money, and they had intended to share it with the entire family. And would I please be willing to give them my bank account number so they could distribute the wealth? And my husband agreed to do this with me. To make a long story short, we had over $300,000 in that bank, and it's now gone. And she's crying. She says, I feel so stupid. And my family is against me because I did this stupid thing. And I don't know what I'm going to do because I only have $75,000 left to my name, besides Medicare. Now, what do you do at that moment? Can you magically fill that bank account back up? There's only one person I know to direct her to solve that problem. So what did I do? I already knew she was a praying person. If she wasn't, I would have asked her this question. Are you a prayerful person? If they are not, they will say no. If they are, they will say yes. And if they say yes, your next question is, may I pray for you? It's that simple. Yes, I've been told many times, no, I am not a prayerful person, and I don't push it. But it's an easy, non-threatening way to open the door. I didn't ask her if she was a prayerful person. I already knew because we go back quite a few years. I says, may I hold your hand? I bowed my hand, and with my tech sitting beside me, we had a prayer. that God would somehow bring $300,000 back into his bank, but we can't guarantee it. But it's possible that money could be found. She left feeling a little lighter, feeling like somebody understood. All because I asked the question, is there anything else I can do for you? I'll share another quick story with you. Hopefully my time doesn't get too carried away here. Many years ago, a patient came into the practice who had an unfortunate result with cataract surgery in one eye and cataract maturing on the other eye. And the physician had stated to her that if she had cataract surgery on the other eye, she would go blind because of the complications resulting from the first cataract surgery. So this person was obviously in emotional stress, came for a second opinion. I had no relationship to that patient at that moment. And so I asked her the question, are you a prayerful person? She said, yes. So I says, can I pray for you? She said, yes. So we had a short prayer. After the prayer, I says, well, after doing your exam today, I feel like that there is a good possibility that you can receive care and that you'll see. But realizing the extent of the emotional trauma she was under, I says, I need you to go home and I need you to think about it because you have to believe what I just told you. And I can tell that at this moment you don't believe that. So I says, you do not need an appointment, but the moment that you decide that you want to take the jump of faith and trust my words and come get this cataract surgery done, you just show up at my office and say, I want to speak to Dr. Beckner. About 2 weeks later, she showed up in the exact same puddle of tears that she was last time. And by all intents and purposes, you would not think that she was ready, except for one thing. She walked into the room. That told me what I needed to know. So we had another prayer, and I told her to believe that God would, in fact, take good care of her. And I sent her to the best clinic I knew at the time. And if Paul Chung was here, he would know who that was. And it was with some great joy and pleasure that I got to do her one-day post-op. She was seeing 20/25. Every practice is different. So I'm sharing this with you to challenge you to realize that there is no one perfect way to share Jesus Christ in your office. I'm going to be asking you some questions. And I'm going to be honest with you, in my particular practice, we have 3 doctors right now. 2 months ago, we had 4 doctors. One of them went full-time in his primary position, so he's no longer my day off doctor, as I called him. But we have multiple faiths represented in our practice. So with multiple faiths in the practice who have varying different opinions on religion, how do you share Jesus? Will you share doctrines, or will you simply share Jesus? And when you hire in a multi-faith setting, how do you do that? Are you up front with them that your office has prayer every single day? Now, they're not going to be required to pray, but someone will pray. And what we've discovered is that even if you are not embracing Christianity, for some reason you still have no problem raising your hand and say, would you pray for my mother? And we see it all the time. What about doctrinal literature in the practice? Most of us are definitely signed on to that. Question, in a multi-faith practice, how does that work? Something you have to think through. What about music in the practice? Does the music have an influence on the patronage of your practice? Does it tell the patient who you are? what you stand for? I believe it should, and we do. We pray K-Love. I would like to play more Adventist-specific music, but that's what meets the needs of my clientele, and it communicates the message they need to hear. Media in the practice. What kind of media do you allow in practice? Fill your waiting rooms. We personally appreciate a quiet practice, time for thought and prayer, and so we do have some community advertising going on in our waiting area, but it's completely silent. And it's all multiple businesses in the community that most people recognize, and it's actually very well received. Prayer in the practice. We talked a little bit that already, our willingness to have prayer in the practice. We do that at the staff meeting, in which we go around the circle and we discuss and pray for patients. We discuss and pray for staff. We discuss and pray for family members. And it's the custom, and we just introduce it your first day in practice at staff meeting. This is how we do, no big deal. So far, the two doctors are very comfortable praying, and the staff, an office manager. One doctor is not ready to do that yet, but she's definitely on board. Just not ready to take that step. Prayer in the morning huddle is really important. We think that's a great way to start the day. How about your hours of operation? Do you think your hours of operation tell something about your practice? I can tell you our experience is we close at 1 o'clock on Friday, just simply because, we just didn't really want the challenge of having to navigate, sunset in the winter. And now we have three doctors in the practice of varying face. We have staff of varying face. And I think it'd be mutiny if I decided to work any later than 1 o'clock on Friday. How may I share the love and presence of Jesus with my community? Well, the first thing you have to do if you want to get involved in your community is show up. You have to just go there, get involved. You have to accept invitations, realizing that they are, in fact, opportunities. And you need to recognize the principle that a situation is actually an opportunity. I made the mistake once to having a discussion with my banker. And I used the word problem in our discussion. And he stopped me and says, Dr. Beckner, he says, we do not have problems at our bank. We only have situations because we haven't quite created them into opportunities yet. And I thought that was brilliant. So in my life, when the situation gets to the point where I want to go like this, that's a physiological clue that I need to stop and look around and see what is the opportunity that I am sitting right next to. We live in a college town, Eastern Oregon University. It's a rural college town, but it has a decent reputation, and we have kids from all over the Northwest that come to La Grande, Oregon. A pretty strong allied health program there, and is the practice of that university to invite in community members to share. So they, a number of years ago, asked my partner and I if we would come and share about the unique career opportunity of optometry. So we went in and set up a little slideshow, and we explained a little bit about the educational requirements of becoming an optometrist. We explained them a little bit about the average day of an optometrist. And then we got into the whiz-bang things about when you could really save a life, you know. Mr. Brad, M.D., over here was sharing with us a story of a little girl who had, I can't even say the name right, but it's a compressive brain disease where the brainstem is being crushed by the weight of the brain. And she had approximately, hours or days left to live before the brain would literally stop her from breathing. I can think of one that we just had the other day where my youngest doctor went in and the posterior retina looked like a war. It looked like closest to some of those AIDS patients you've seen where the blood's just everywhere. And, you know, she's been in practice a year and a half, and she looks at that retina and goes, oh my, what is this? As it turns out, it was nothing more than an extremely out-of-control hypertension. Bad enough that the ER sent her out. No idea at all that she had a problem, except that her vision was a little wavy. And yet the retinal edema, we don't know how she saw as well as she did looking at that retina. It was full of edema. And, you know, at the end of the day, you go home saying, did I make a difference? I think that doc went home thinking she made a difference that day. So we told some of those, you know, exciting stories about optometry making a difference in the lives of our patients. And then at the end of the session, because I'm very comfortable with it, I said, I think that you guys have some really nice questions. It was a room approximately the size of this one here. It had single chairs, no tables. And it was so full that they had students with their legs in front of they were sitting down with their legs in front of the walkway, in front of the chairs there. And then they had some clean out here at the front. So I said, well, there's a good crowd in here, let's ask some questions. And so they started asking questions. And I was in my height of enjoyment, asking questions, answering questions rather. And this one student, about halfway down, one of the last ones that had come in, that was still sitting down there, she says, doctor, she says, I know that you may not remember, but it's a lot of stress being a student. And she says, there's times when you don't get any sleep at all, just trying to make sure that you've studied well enough and you're making the test. And she says, there's burnout, and there's people that literally are falling out of this profession because they can't handle the stress. Do you have any suggestions for us on how to manage stress in our pre-medical career here? And I smiled to myself, and I said, this is going to be a fun one. So I started out saying, many times the reason we have stress in life is because, at least in my case, I didn't plan well. I didn't study when I should have. Or I didn't plan my, my schedule for that day very well. I didn't prepare. I says, but, life happens. Sometimes you can't change that. And the other thing happens is that, sometimes there's opportunities where we can do things where we can actually do two things at once. Like if you get a job down at the motel, a late night agent, check-in person at the motel, they'll allow you to study when you're not in front of a customer. Oh yeah, that's great. But I says, I'm going to give you my biggest clue, and I says, and most of you in this room are going to be very shocked at my next answer. I want you to know that the greatest way that you can handle stress is to not study, not do anything at all for 24 hours. And it was so fun to look at their faces when I told them that. I want you to know that I went all the way through optometry school following that rule. And I says, I think it blessed me. But I was never so shocked in my life to hear the person behind me, my associate, say, yes, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that I did the exact same thing. At that moment, I don't know who was more shocked. I think those young people left that the university setting that day, realizing that two doctors from completely different point of view on religion still understand the core of its principles. It was a great pleasure to, to share that day. Natural ways to enter the community. Radio advertising educational program turned out to be a real helpful thing for me. I like to dialogue and do questions. So just an informational program where you share just some topics from the profession. Many programs will do that for you for free. They have a community program where they invite people to come on, and if you're consistent and if you have an outline so they don't have to prod you, they kind of know what the next question is. If you make it easy for the announcer, you'll become a star on their program. I did that for 20 years, 25 years. And, you know, everybody in the town knows who Dr. Dan is. Why? Well, they heard him on the radio. It's just a great program. Career day at a high school, college, they love for you to show up. They're always looking for people that will fill the room so that when the students come through, they feel like they spent their time well. Volunteer for a service club. It's a great way to get involved in your community. I'm personally a Lion, and I've enjoyed that for many years. We also promoted the practice with an annual kids block party. Basically, we wanted to deliver services to children, so we invited all the community people who delivered services to children. We're going to come this day. We're going to do eye screenings for all the kids. We're going to, anybody that wants to provide services can take up our parking lot, and we'll serve refreshments, and we made a day of it. And the only requirement was you couldn't charge for anything. We didn't charge for anything. You can't charge for anything. And that went over really well, and unfortunately, since COVID, we haven't got back on the bandwagon. Preach the Word of God. Be prepared whether the time is favorable or not. Practice, correct, rebuke, and encourage people with good teachings. For a time is coming when people no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. 2 Timothy 2:2-3. Franciscus of Assisi said, preach the gospel at all times, and if necessary, use words. I want to back up and tell you one more story. Somehow in this presentation, I think that was my last slide, yeah. So somehow in this presentation, we missed one category, and that's the category of fellow workers. So since I missed that slide, we're going to see if we can put it back in here. So when you pray with the practice and you pray with both the community and your fellow workers, you gain a reputation of being willing to talk about spiritual things. It becomes well known. This is the practice that's just willing to talk about things like this. So one day I was out in the sidewalk adjacent to our practice, checking the drip lines that feed the hanging baskets, because if the wind comes and twirls them around too much, it pinches off the drip tube and that basket dries out. So I was out doing that, and I noticed this patient come in that I recognized, and he had this paper right here in his hand. Well, there's nothing so unusual about a patient carrying a piece of paper, is it? So he went inside, and he was in there for about 5 minutes, just long enough for me to fix the problem. And he was coming out. I said hello, and he says, Dr. Dan, he says, your optician isn't in today. Yeah, I says, I'm sorry, she's out for the day. He says, well, I brought this piece of paper in for her, but he says, I would like to share it with you. So he handed me this piece of paper right here, and he says, well, I just want you to know that my wife and I experienced a miracle. So mind you, he came all the way into the practice to give this piece of paper to my optician, and he wants me to hear his story of a miracle. And it goes something like this. I am a sculptor, and I've been so for 40 years. And we first make a wax model, and we put clay on it, and then we put, and I don't know the process completely, but anyway, they end up with a bronze statue out of it. And he has 40 years of these masterpieces sitting in his basement. He went to sleep one night, and unbeknownst to him, there was a large windstorm and a lightning fire that came through our town. and it hit one of the main lines, and it cooked some of the transformers, which in turn sent high voltage line of electricity down the lines into some of the houses and causes them to short inside the main panel just below the meter and started fires. And it did it all at the same time. So there's not one fire or two fires, but there's approximately 4 at the same time. He woke up at 1:30, I think it was, and he smelled something, but he kind of ignored it and went back to sleep. And at 2:30, he woke up and said, man, there's something wrong. I got to get up. Being a Christian, he heard the Lord speaking to him and telling him that you need to go investigate what this fire is. So he put on his pants, and he was going to put on his shoes, and the voice said to him, you don't have time to put on your shoes. Would you please go down the hall? So he went down the hall, and he couldn't find anything, but the smell got stronger. And when he went past his studio door, he could feel the radiant heat. Now, if you are a sculptor and you have wax molds, what happens if you have radiant heat? Well, they melt to a puddle. As he would like to say, these are my children. So he stopped at the door and said, God, do I go in or not? Because if I open the door, there could be a blazing fire. And he couldn't quite decide which way he should go because he thought, well, I could run if the flame come that after me. And God said, your children are in there, go. He thought, my children. And then he remembered that he called them children. And then he thought of that little story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being in the fire. And he said to himself, well, they were God's children. So he opened the door, and he saw black smoke to here, gray smoke to here, and barely visible smoke down there. So he got on his knees, and he crawled back in there, and sure enough, there was this burning ember fire about this big in the corner of the room. He says, I didn't know what to do, and the voice told me, look to your right. And I looked to the right, and there was a fire extinguisher I'd put there some 18 years before. So I pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher, and he says, I fought with it for quite a while. And he says, I finally got the thing open, and he says, I felt like I was looking right into hell. Pulled the pin on the thing, and he says, and I put the thing out as best I could. And then I left the room. On the way out, I says, God, do I leave this door open or closed? God says, close the door and suffocate it. So he says, I closed the door and suffocated it. I yelled 911 to my wife, who was still in bed, and said, call the fire department. By the way, was there any power on in the room? No, the reason he knew there was no power in the room, because when he passed his office, the backup power fan was running. And he realized there was no power in the room, or in the house. It was 20 degrees outside. It was in winter. He had one fire hose sitting on the back of the back porch. And as he went around to the side of the house to see if he could put out the fire on the outside of the house, this voice told him, you're going to need another hose. So he went out to the shed, grabbed another hose and bare feet, connected the two together, and proceeded to put out the fire. Now, there's only so much water in a pressurized pump system when there is no electricity. And that's the exact amount of water he had in that hose to put out that fire. And he managed to put out all the visible flames above the meter where it had shorted out. He called back to 911 and said, I'm a sculptor. All my babies are in the bottom of this thing. Can you please send somebody? They showed up with 12 fire trucks, some Baker City, some from Embler, some from Elgin. We're a county where there's lots of fire departments. And they proceeded to put the fire out. By that time, the fire had gotten up into the attic and was doing considerable damage, but it had been slowed up in the basement. And the firefighters went to the basement immediately to see what they could do to salvage his babies. So, long story short, they got the fire out. Some of the air-suspended pieces of the wax molds were completely melted, like the bridles and the reins and stirrups. But the major masses were still basically unhurt. With that much radiant heat, he was very surprised. It's in the dead of winter. It's very cold outside, and the house was uninhabitable. In Grand Oregon, we don't have a lot of surplus in rentals. But he trusted the Lord. He says, "The Lord, if you protected us, I'm sure you have a plan." The fire department, the very next day, came back, and they said, "Oh, by the way, your neighbor, your property owner next door, has a vacant house, and he would like for you to know that you and your wife can move in there." Now, I tell all this story not to tell you about the patient. I told you I was going to tell you about coworkers. So I felt like that if the patient felt this strongly about this story and was willing to share this witness, and it okayed us, that I should share this very story with my staff at staff meeting the next week. And I started this whole story by saying, now, I don't know where you are with God. I don't know whether you believe that he is somebody that started this place and ran off, or you think he's still here, or you don't believe in him at all. I'm just going to share with you a story of someone who does. And I read the story. That's it. Said a prayer, and that was the end of that. About a week later, one of my newer hired employees came to the back of the office and said, "I'm really sorry, but I could not see that particular patient." And so I asked one of the other staff members to see that particular patient, pre-test and work him up for the doctor. And I says, what seems to be the challenge? She says, I had a very difficult childhood, and this person reminded me of my uncle. And I was thinking the worst. But it was actually the opposite. This uncle had befriended her and encouraged her through some very difficult losses in her immediate family. And when he passed away unpredictably, or unannounced, you might say, she was more affected by that than the other people that had been passed in her own family because of that relationship. And having not working through the pain of that loss yet, this patient who walked through the door that was a spitting image of her uncle, she couldn't deal with it. And so I looked her in the eye and says, well, do you think that God had anything to do with that? She says, well, I don't know. That's where she was. She didn't know yet where she stood with God. I says, I'm glad that you were able to pass this person off to be served by another staff member. But I want you to know that I think God allowed this. Because there's some pain and some hurt in there, and he needs you to process that out and realize that that uncle who loved you so much and got you through some tough times is still looking after you. He's sending you reminders by the Spirit of God to tell you that you aren't forgotten. Everybody looks at things a little differently, and it's not my job to tell any of my staff exactly what to believe on a particular belief issue. But when it comes to the issue of does God exist and does he care, and is he involved in your life, and is he arranging circumstances for you, I am absolutely clear that he's involved. He's there. He's working. The only reason she came and talked to me is because of this letter right here. When she heard that story, she was challenged to believe that God could deal with the challenges of her life, and she's still dealing with those at this very moment. But she gained confidence to know that there was people around her that believed that God was good, and he was still involved and still cared with the challenges that we individually experience. Patients know They can read you like a book when you shake their hand and look into your eyes. Staff knows. They know whether you love them or not. So I would like to end this conversation. I see we have a few more minutes, so we're going to hear another story here in just a second. I would like to end this conversation by saying that we can plan to share Christ. We can make preparations to share Christ. But ultimately it comes down to two things. When he speaks to you and says, Dan, I want you to do this, you first of all have to recognize his voice. And the second of all, you have to get out of the argumentative cerebral mode that I get into so many times when I tell him, God, you're crazy. And all God says is just obey. Because when you get done, you're going to be so glad you did. That's all there is to witnessing. It's that simple. And a multi-faith practice. And I would share more on that, but I think that covers what I wanted to share today. So I would like to introduce to you my friend and colleague, Troy and Janice Bailey. This particular story came to us on the Alaska airline trip between Seattle and here. It's about as new a story as you can get. And I listened to this story, enjoyed it very much. And I know that you'll be blessed if you listen to the rest of the story. And since I'm out of words, I'm excited to have them come up and share with you.
They got to hear me. Okay, so we're going to make this 2-hour story about a 3-minute story. As you can see by the height of my husband, I try to plan accordingly, and so I get the exit row. And they come up, the airline stewardess, or I guess they're flight attendants now, to ask each one of us if we will verbally, audibly say out loud, will you be able to physically open the door? So we take off, we get to our cruising altitude, and then they said, we have a medical emergency. Is there anybody on the flight that can help? And immediately he looks at me, because that's the sign that I'm supposed to push the button, because I'm the registered nurse. He says he only does eyes. That's not true. And so I had a green cover. I wear layers in the planes because they're cold or hot or whatever. Anyway, I put my hand up to hit the bell, and she said, the lady with the green jacket will be right there. So they come running down the aisle, and they say, we have a medical emergency. This gal has this terrible allergic reaction to her eyes. And I turned to him, and I said, you're up. And he's like, what? So he's taking out his stuff and handing them to me and crawling out because he was by the window. And then I thought to myself, well, it could be systemic. I'll just go with him. So we went with him. And long and the short, her name is Duni, D-U-N-I. And you can be praying for her. We spent 2 hours with her. And she was having a terrible allergic reaction, and throat was starting to close. And so I'm like, does anybody have Benadryl? And asked, to do it sublingual. And I'm praying. But then I just thought, okay, I have to pray out loud. And so I'm sitting on the little jump seat next to her, and we pray. And, as soon as we get back there, there's 2 other flight attendants. And so somehow Troy got off to the side. What were you thinking?
I was very comfortable when it was an eye thing. She's got allergic conjunctivitis. We go back there, and sure enough, eyes are swelling up. She's got little welts. Eyes are chemosis. And start cool compresses, Benadryl, artificial tears. Somebody had some great Oasis drops, which I like anyway. But then all of a sudden it changes. And she's starting to do this. I'm telling her how she's breathing. She goes, I'm breathing fine. She goes, well, I'm real congested, but my throat is just itchy and a little hot. And then pretty soon she's starting to scratch on her legs. and then her head. And I'm going, nope, this is beyond my eye stuff. And so then we started talking about the EpiPen, and
I had said, would you please call your physician on the ground? And I also turned to the other one and I said, what's the nearest airport? We need to get her medical help now. So
Alaska has EpiPens in two separate packets in two different locations, and they had epinephrine with no needles, and they had this cartridge for an EpiPen that was in a separate pack, and they have all this stuff. It was not very well organized, and the stewardesses, they are trained for being first responders, but they didn't know. This was all, later they said they don't really get up-to-date training, or they don't have...
It's not part of their annual training is to go through these packs.
So while they're looking for hopefully there's an Epi cartridge or an EpiPen there, then the other gal's calling the doctor on the phone, and...
I'm motioning for him to get over here because he's like 2 people away, and I need him to pray here and out loud because there's something about that person in a crisis who doesn't feel like they can breathe. Because I had said, I'm a believer. Would it be okay if I prayed? And she goes, that would be wonderful. And she's really struggling to breathe. So I'd already done that. I can't find the EpiPen. Or we had found the Carpajet, but there was no needle. We found vials of Epi, but no needle, no syringe. So that's when I'm motioning to him, please come over here and pray. So he's, trying to get between them and us and pray out loud. And he is such a calming force. He's a rock. Because he knows the rock and he falls on that rock.
And when we prayed, eventually when I came over to pray, she had found the cartridge and very slyly and used the cartridge on the young lady's leg. And then at that point, we've all kind of been there when you've reached the end of what you can do. But then there's somebody else, and you can up it to them. And that's with the prayer, I'm just telling the Lord, we've done everything we know how to do to help this young lady. And we know that you love her and that you want to heal her, and we know that you are the great healer. And when you can do that, when you have that peace, the Lord works. And he did work.
She got another 25 of Benadryl, so she got a total of 50 of Benadryl. They also suggested giving Zofran. I have no idea what the Zofran was for, but maybe because they thought since they'd given the Epi that she might get nauseous because her heart was racing so fast. So I knew she was going to need a big, long nap. And they did call the paramedics, came out in the ambulance to meet her at the back of the plane. She refused to go out the front. She wants people to get out. And I'm thinking, this is a destination. They're not connecting with anywhere to go on. So anyway, but still praying for Dooney. And through all of this, I tried to keep her talking so I could assess her breathing and also to find out fairly newly divorced, mom of 3, new to this industry, and not agreeing with her 19-year-old son and her ex-husband's position on him with his girlfriend. And so pray for Dooney, and pray also because the rest of this story, which some of you have not heard, is once I agree that I will stay with her and I will call you, go quick, get everybody water for their one water drink and to give their meals to the people that had bought their meals. He went back to his seat and I stayed with her, And once they did the quick run, the service run, they came back, and the one that, you know, had been on the phone with on the ground physician, etc., something got said, and she asked me if we were Christians, and I said yes. And I said that's why I had to have my husband come over, as I needed him to pray out loud. I mean, I already knew he was praying, but I needed to hear that because it's calming. So they said, okay, we can't have you sit here, as we were getting ready to land, and they're getting really close to landing. So I sat down, and the gal next to me said, thank you so much for going and help. She goes, I just let my nursing license relapse. And she said, I had decided I was going to retire. And so when they called, she thought, I'm not qualified. And she says, and the both of you looked at each other and just did it without even hesitating. And she goes, thank you so much for doing that. So she wanted to know the details, and so I shared with her. And then she goes, well, I hope you're going for a very relaxing time. And I said, well, we're actually going to a medical conference. And she goes, oh, what is it for nursing, or it's for optometry? And I said, well, actually, so I explained about Amen. And I told about the Adventist church, and that, you know, we are strong believers to be the hands and feet of Jesus, and that this conference was specifically to teach us how to bless our patients, to share with them the love of Jesus. And she was like, wow, that is so cool. So now you can pray for Shannon.
Thanks, Troy and Janice Bailey, for sharing that story with us. Pretty exciting to think that we can make a difference wherever we are. That's all I have. Any questions? Thank you for your attention.